Welcome back. Before we talk about actual stitches, I'd like to talk for a moment about stitching techniques. So today I am working in a Q-snap frame, which is a square frame made of sort of piping plastic that has then external pieces to clamp it down. You can also work with a hoop or a scroll frame, depending on the type of work you like to do, the type of fabric or size of fabric that you're working with, as well as the space that you're working in. This is a somewhat constrained space, so I'm going to work with a more constrained frame. So, many apologies, my cats have noises to make. So when you're working in a frame, it's a little bit easier to work right or left-handed because you're going to want as much as possible to keep one hand up and one hand down. And so let's just do some straight stitches just to kind of demonstrate that, because then I can try to find the place that I want to be. I can see where this is and then pick out the spot that I want. As well, it helps me to keep one hand that will manage when I'm doing a looped stitch, to be able to manage the thread on top. It helps me to keep from twisting the thread nearly so much, and it helps me to prevent knots as well. Excuse me. So the other thing is that if my right or left hand might be better suited, I can switch fairly easily. So I can have right hand on top or left hand on top, and it doesn't make too much difference to my stitching. So if you're a left-handed stitcher, working in a frame might be easy, or might be easier than trying to work freehand, just if you're trying to learn from someone who isn't used to teaching left-handed stitching. However, also, there are some stitches that really work best in a frame because the fabric is kept under tension, so I don't have to worry about the tension of my thread pulling and stretching the fabric and then maybe crumpling it once it's done. So it's also a good idea to talk about tension, which is I would like my stitches to sit relatively tidy and flush when they're nice straight stitches, or when I'm doing a curved stitch. I don't want them to be pulling the warp and weft threads of my ground fabric out of alignment. So I want to have them not too loose, oh dear, but also not be pulling. So that sort of thing. And you'll get an idea for your own particular tension. And so long as you're consistent, honestly, doesn't make too much of a difference. Similarly, you want your stitch sizes to be relatively consistent as much as you can make them. But if you have one stitch that is different from the others, honestly, in a larger piece that has hundreds or maybe thousands of stitches, probably no one is going to notice. You might notice, you might want to go back and fix it, but I would recommend that when you're starting out, when you're doing practice pieces, don't worry too much about the size of your stitches. Don't worry too much about how pretty they are. Just keep stitching. It'll make it a lot easier to keep going. And so then the other thing to keep in mind for right-handed versus left-handed stitchers is that right-handed people are going to tend to want to stitch from the right to the left, moving your needle across the frame. So depending on what kind of stitch you're doing, that might mean that your direction of stitch is moving this way, or it might mean that the direction is moving this way. We'll get into that later with the different types of stitches. However, if you're a left-handed stitcher, you're going to want to move the opposite way, always wanting to be moving your hand towards the center of your body. It's just the easiest way to do it. However, if you're having difficulty or you can't turn your work and you have to work across, what you might want to do is be able to work up and down. So right to left hand doesn't make too much difference. Have I tied a knot? I have tied a knot. this is why we want to manage our thread, because otherwise it'll twist. So right and left hand are going to have pretty much the same ease of up and down. So sometimes it's just easier to work up and down away from yourself or towards yourself rather than right to left. The other thing I'd like to talk about today is holding the needle. So when I am holding my needle, I want to typically grasp it with my thumb and forefinger on either side of the eye of the needle, and then I'll have my my middle finger is going to be giving me a little bit of tension to control where I'm pointing my finger. So the reason for that is that if I'm grasping further down, I'll either unthread my needle, or I might just put more wear and pull on here than I want, and that can be quite damaging to threads, especially more delicate threads. So if I'm grasping the needle at the eye between my thumb and forefinger, then I'm putting less tension and damage on the thread. I have better control, and it just works a little tidier. So again, even on my underhand, which we can't see right now, I'm holding it in the same way. So when I'm receiving it, I can move my thumb away if I'm kind of controlling the thread here. So it's just helps me to make sure that my tension is staying even and I'm not damaging my thread. Two more things to talk about before we get into our actual stitches. One is your thread. If you have a thread that isn't color fast, it might discolor your fabric. Often this will wash out, and often when you've been hand stitching something for a little while, you will want to wash it before you use it or frame it, because even when you're working with fresh, clean hands, still humans are filthy, filthy creatures. So you want to keep your work as clean and tidy as possible. So it's always good to know if your thread is going to discolor your work, because then you may or may not be able to wash that without some kind of chemical process that will help the colors to become color fast and not bleed onto your work. So the other thing to keep in mind is if you're working with threads that are less color fast, then you want to be very certain that you're not stitching someplace that you would mind if they bled on it. So keep that in mind. And then the last thing is when we're stitching outside of a frame. So if you're holding something in your hand, you can absolutely create the tension of a frame by using your fingers on the front and back, create some tension. Or if it's not a stitch that needs that, then you can just hold it. I like to keep my middle finger on the back so that I can tell where I'm stitching. And when I'm doing straight stitches, sometimes I use a thimble. There we are. But so if I'm doing, we do a stab stitch in a frame, but we'll do a scooping or sewing stitch when we're working in the hand sometimes. And some stitches work way better if we do it that way. So a running stitch, for example, actually I can show you the difference between if I do it as a scooping stitch versus as a stab stitch. There's a visible difference in the stitch, and it has to do with the tension. So it's also harder to have one hand up, one hand down when we're working outside of a frame. Here we are. So because these are angling when they go in, there's a slight difference to the look of the tension, whereas the way that the stabbed ones work, these were done with a straight up and down more or less, and they will be more even. And this is especially visible when we get into a double running stitch or a Holbein later. However, for left-handed people who are working outside of a frame, like I said, you typically want your stitch direction to be going opposite. So If I'm doing a running stitch or anything where the stitch direction and the needle direction are the same, then I will, same with the back stitch. I'll do it in the opposite direction as I would if I were right-handed. And then if I were doing a stem stitch, I would want to be working this way so that I could have, that's why I like to do these in a frame. It's much tidier. Okay, here we are. So up and down. And here's where, if I move this up and down, it's the same in my left hand as it would be in my right hand. So sometimes one hand or the other is just easier. If you are right hand dominant, left hand dominant, and don't have an easy time switching between, that's fine. Find ways to get around it. So let's get on to stitching. One thing I forgot, because it doesn't come before you stitch, but at the end or in the middle, is on the back side. Let's flip this over. How do I finish off my work? Well, my favorite way, if I'm doing knots on the back, is to just do a half hitch, which is going to be the same as a lot of the loop stitches. So I will go underneath one of my previous stitches, hook my thread over, and then pull that. And if I do one or two of those, it should be pretty tidy. If we're not doing a knot, then what we'll do is we'll either backstitch or whip stitch through the last few stitches before we cut it off, and maybe even reverse direction so that there's a little bit of tension and that's not going to come apart. Like I say, a little bit heavier, but it's not the heaviness of a knot, so you won't notice it.